Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a subject that can be kind of shrouded in mystery and often a lot of misconception, and that is childhood mental disorders.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a university-level psychology textbook as our guide, and we're really focusing in on the unit that covers childhood mental disorders.
It is a deep dive for sure.
It is. It's a deep dive into a world that can feel both familiar and incredibly complex.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, we all know kids can be challenging, right? But where is that line? Where's the line between typical kid behavior and something more serious? That's what I'm kind of hoping we can shed some light on in this deep dive.
Absolutely. And you might be surprised to learn that some conditions that we think of as distinctly adult, like depression, actually manifest quite differently in children.
Yeah.
So it's an important distinction to make.
Okay, so let's get into it. The textbook starts with a category called Pervasive Developmental Disorders, or PDDs. And it defines them as delays in developing those basic skills, particularly in areas like social interaction, communication, and using their imagination.
Yeah, and it's important to note that PDDs are not always obvious in those early years. Sometimes a child might seem to be developing, typically, until they reach around 3 years old. And then parents and caregivers start to notice that something's not quite right.
So what are some of the things that, some of those red flags that parents might start to see?
Well, the textbook lists some general symptoms, but it's how those symptoms cluster together that can really be a clue. For instance, difficulty with communication might go beyond just late talking. It could involve these unusual patterns of speech, like repeating phrases that they hear,
Yeah.
which is echolalia, or having a very flat, almost robotic way of talking.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but how they're using the language to interact
Exactly.
with the world.
Exactly. And then you might see unusual play behaviors. Instead of engaging in imaginative play with other children, they might be fixated on things like lining up toys or engaging in repetitive actions like flapping their hands.
It's like their world is governed by a different set of rules.
In a way, yes. And then there's the sensory piece. Some children with PDDs are hypersensitive to certain things, like sounds, textures, or even smells. Just imagine a child who has a meltdown because the tag on their shirt feels scratchy or the sound of a vacuum cleaner is unbearable.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It can be very challenging.
So we're talking about a whole constellation of symptoms, not just one isolated behavior.
Right. And it's important to remember that PDDs exist on a spectrum. Some children are mildly affected, while others experience much more significant challenges.
Now, the textbook spends a good chunk of time on autism, which I know is a very specific type of PDD.
Yeah, and it's one that's often misunderstood. The textbook breaks down those core features of autism into 3 areas: impaired social interaction, communication difficulties, and restricted or repetitive behaviors.
So can you give us a concrete example of how those features might play out in a child's life?
Sure. So let's say you have a 5-year-old boy with autism. You take him to a birthday party. And while all the other kids are running around playing tag and interacting with each other, he's sitting in a corner, completely absorbed in spinning the wheels of a toy car.
Oh, wow.
He doesn't seem interested in those other kids, and when they try to engage him, he doesn't respond in a typical way.
Yeah, so the social piece is really about that back and forth, that give and take that we as, like, I guess, neurotypical people do so naturally.
Exactly. And it's not that they don't want to connect, it's that their brains are wired differently.
Yeah.
And social interaction can be incredibly challenging.
And what about the communication piece? Is it always about delayed speech?
Not necessarily. Some children with autism do have delayed speech, but others might speak fluently. The challenge is often with the pragmatics of language, like the social rules of communication. They might struggle to understand things like sarcasm, humor, or non-literal language.
So imagine trying to navigate a conversation where you're constantly missing those subtle cues that most people pick up on effortlessly. It must be incredibly frustrating.
It is, and then there are those repetitive behaviors. These can range from hand flapping and rocking to more complex rituals like needing to arrange their toys in a specific order or having a meltdown if their routine is disrupted.
The textbook actually mentions a fascinating link between autism and seizures,
Oh, yeah.
and that a significant number of individuals with autism also experience seizures.
Yes, which adds another layer of complexity to the condition.
Absolutely. And there's even a rare syndrome called Landau-Kleffner syndrome, where children suddenly lose their language skills and develop those autistic-like behaviors, often due to seizure activity.
That's right.
It's a reminder that the brain is a complex and interconnected system, and sometimes seemingly unrelated symptoms can be linked in these surprising ways.
Absolutely.
The textbook is very clear about debunking the myth that vaccines cause autism.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that research overwhelmingly points to biological causes.
That's a crucial point to address, is that misinformation has caused a lot of unnecessary fear and harm.
Absolutely. Now, in addition to autism, the textbook covers a few other PDDs, and one that really caught my eye was Rett's disorder.
Yes,
It just sounds absolutely heartbreaking.
it is a devastating condition, and it primarily affects girls.
Wow.
Imagine a child developing typically for the first year or two of life, hitting all their developmental milestones, and then suddenly they start to regress.
Like you're going backward in time.
Exactly. They lose those skills they once had. Their hand movements become repetitive and almost involuntary. Often with this characteristic hand-wringing motion and communication becomes increasingly difficult.
It must be so challenging for the families watching their child lose those abilities they once had.
It is, and unfortunately there is no cure for Rett's disorder. But early intervention can help manage symptoms and improve quality of life.
The textbook also mentions Asperger Syndrome, which used to be a separate diagnosis, but is now considered to be part of the autism spectrum.
That's right. Individuals with Asperger syndrome often have average or above average intelligence, but they struggle with social interaction and communication. They might have difficulty understanding social cues, interpreting facial expressions, or engaging in that reciprocal conversation.
So, like, reading those social cues is really difficult.
Yeah, it can be very challenging for them.
But the textbook does point out that many individuals with Asperger's have these unique strengths, like an intense focus and ability to recognize patterns.
Absolutely. They often excel in areas like math, science, music, or art, where their attention to detail and that ability to hyper-focus can be incredibly valuable assets.
So it's a reminder that these conditions are not just about deficits, but they also come with unique abilities and ways of seeing the world.
Exactly.
And then there's childhood disintegrative disorder, also known as Heller's syndrome.
Yes.
And this one is extremely rare and incredibly concerning because it involves a period of normal development followed by a dramatic loss of skills, typically between the ages of 3 and 10.
It can be devastating.
It's like their development comes to a screeching halt and then reverses.
Yes. And it can be very difficult to predict or explain why this happens. Children with CDD might lose language skills, social skills, bowel and bladder control, and even motor skills.
It's like their brain is erasing everything they've learned.
In a way, yes, it's a devastating condition, and there's currently no known cure.
And then finally, we have pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS.
Yes, this is a catch-all diagnosis for children who exhibit some, but not all, of the characteristics of autism.
Okay.
It recognizes that these conditions exist on a spectrum, and sometimes a child's symptoms don't fit neatly into one specific category.
It's a way of acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that there's a lot of variability within these disorders.
Exactly, and it's important to remember the diagnosis is just the beginning. The real work lies in understanding the individual child's needs and finding the right supports and interventions to help them reach their full potential.
Speaking of understanding individual needs, let's move on to another really common childhood disorder, ADHD. And I know everyone's heard of ADHD, but I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions out there.
Oh, absolutely. Even the name itself, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can be misleading because it implies that these kids have a deficit of attention, when in reality it's more about an inability to regulate their attention.
So it's not that they can't pay attention, it's that their attention is constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
Exactly. And the hyperactivity piece isn't always about running around like a wild child. It can also manifest as this constant mental restlessness, like their brain is always in overdrive.
Yeah.
It's go, go, go all the time.
The textbook highlights 3 core areas of ADHD: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. Inattention can show up as things like difficulty focusing on details, making careless mistakes, getting easily distracted, having trouble following instructions, losing things, and being forgetful.
It's like their brain is a browser with a million tabs open and they can't seem to close any of them.
That's a great analogy. And then there's hyperactivity, which can show up as things like fidgeting, squirming, talking excessively, having trouble sitting still, always being on the go, and even feeling restless inside.
So it's not always about physical hyperactivity. It can also be a feeling of mental restlessness.
Exactly. And then we have impulsivity, which is all about acting without thinking. They might blurt out answers, interrupt others constantly, have trouble waiting their turn, or act without considering those consequences.
It's like they have a hair trigger response system, and their actions often precede their thoughts.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And these impulsive behaviors can often get them into trouble, both socially and academically.
Now, the textbook goes beyond those classic symptoms and talks about some less obvious aspects of ADHD, like clumsiness and difficulty with time perception.
Yeah.
Those are often overlooked, but can have a significant impact on a child's life. Imagine struggling to tie your shoes, constantly bumping into things, or having really messy handwriting.
Right.
It's not just about being a bit clumsy. It can affect their self-esteem and their ability to participate in those activities they enjoy.
And then there's time blindness, or difficulty with time perception. Kids with ADHD often underestimate how long tasks will take, have trouble planning and organizing their time, and they struggle to meet deadlines.
It's like their internal clock is always a bit off.
Exactly. And this can lead to a lot of frustration and stress, both for the child and for those around them.
The textbook delves into the causes of ADHD, and it seems like there's a strong genetic component.
Yeah.
Studies have shown that ADHD often runs in families, and researchers are even identifying specific genes that might increase a person's risk.
It's definitely a fascinating area of research.
So nature definitely plays a role, but what about nurture? Does the environment influence ADHD as well?
It seems so. Studies suggest potential links to smoking and alcohol use during pregnancy, as well as exposure to lead, particularly in early childhood.
So it's this complex interplay of genes and environment, like with so many other conditions.
Right.
Now, what about brain differences? Are there actual differences in the brains of people with ADHD?
Well, brain imaging studies have shown that certain areas of the brain, particularly those involved in attention, executive function, and impulse control, are smaller or function differently in people with ADHD.
So there's a biological basis for these behavioral differences. It's not just a matter of willpower or trying harder.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these brain differences are not the child's fault.
Yeah.
They're simply part of their neurology.
The textbook also debunks a popular myth that sugar causes ADHD.
Oh yeah, the sugar myth. It's been around forever, but there's really no scientific evidence to support it.
Yeah, it's a classic.
The textbook cites a specific study where mothers perceived their children as more hyperactive, even when they were given a sugar substitute.
Wow, so it was all about perception.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's fascinating how our perceptions and expectations can influence what we see, even when it comes to our own children.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of relying on scientific evidence rather than anecdotes or popular beliefs.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with PDDs and ADHD, but this deep dive is far from over.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot more to discuss.
Our textbook covers a whole range of other childhood psychopathologies, from oppositional defiant disorder to conduct disorder, separation anxiety, enyptic disorders, childhood depression, and even mental retardation.
It's really a wide range of conditions.
It's a reminder that childhood is not always a carefree time.
Right.
Many children struggle with mental health challenges, and it's crucial to recognize these struggles and provide that appropriate support.
I completely agree.
So where do we go from here? Are you ready to delve deeper into these other conditions?
I am. There's so much more to unpack, and I'm eager to continue our exploration.
All right, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back in a moment.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of childhood mental disorders.
So before we move on to some new territory, I wanted to circle back to mental retardation, which we kind of touched on at the end of the last segment.
Of course, it's a complex topic that deserves careful consideration. And as we mentioned earlier, early diagnosis and intervention can make a world of difference.
Yeah, the textbook highlights a few specific conditions that, if caught early, can be treated to either slow down or even reverse cognitive decline. It feels like a glimmer of hope in what can often be a really challenging situation.
Absolutely. Take hyperthyroidism, for instance. If a child's thyroid gland is producing too much thyroid hormone, it can impact their intellectual development. But the good news is that with medication and proper management, we can get those hormone levels back on track and prevent further cognitive decline.
So it's not always a permanent situation. There are cases where intervention can really turn things around.
Exactly. And another great example is phenylketonuria, or PKU. It's a genetic disorder where the body can't break down a specific amino acid. But if we catch it early through newborn screening, we can put the child on a special diet that limits that amino acid, and that can prevent the intellectual disability that would otherwise develop.
It's amazing how something as simple as a dietary change can have such a profound impact on a child's life.
It really shows how powerful early intervention can be. Now, beyond those specific medical interventions, the textbook also talks about the importance of providing appropriate support for individuals with mental retardation. It even mentions this alternative classification system developed by the American Association on Mental Retardation, or AMR.
Okay, so what's different about the AMR approach?
Instead of focusing on limitations and labeling people based solely on their IQ scores, the AMR system emphasizes the support needs of the individual. It's a more strengths-based approach that looks at what kind of assistance someone might need to function at their best.
So instead of saying someone is mildly retarded or severely retarded, it's about figuring out what kind of support they need to thrive.
Exactly. The AAMR system uses categories like intermittent support, limited support, extensive support, and pervasive support to really describe those varying levels of assistance individuals might require.
Can you paint a picture for us? What might those different levels of support look like in real life?
Sure. Let's say you have a young adult with mild mental retardation. They might be able to live independently, hold a job, and manage most aspects of their lives on their own. But they might need intermittent support during times of stress or transition, like starting a new job or dealing with a family crisis. Someone with moderate mental retardation might need more consistent assistance with certain tasks, like managing their finances or getting to appointments, but they can still participate in many aspects of community life.
So it's about providing a safety net, not taking over their lives completely.
Right. Now, someone needing extensive support might require regular assistance across various areas of life, such as personal care, communication, and social interaction. Think of someone with severe mental retardation who might need help with dressing, bathing, or preparing meals, and who might need support to communicate their needs and navigate social situations.
And then there's pervasive support, which sounds like the most intensive level of care.
It is. This level of support is for individuals with profound mental retardation who need that constant high-intensity help across all areas of life. They might require round-the-clock care for basic needs and might have limited ability to communicate or interact with their environment.
It sounds like a huge responsibility for caregivers, both families and professionals.
It is a demanding role, but it's also incredibly rewarding. To see someone thrive and reach their full potential, even with significant challenges, is truly inspiring.
This whole conversation about support needs makes me think about how important it is to create a society that values inclusion and accessibility for everyone, regardless of their abilities.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that everyone has something unique to contribute and that diversity enriches our communities.
Well said. Now I think we're ready to move on to some other childhood mental disorders that the textbook covers. There's a whole section on disruptive behavior disorders, which, as a parent, I'm always a little wary of.
I understand. These are the disorders that can really test your patience and make you question your parenting skills. But it's important to remember that behavior is communication. And often these disruptive behaviors are a sign that a child is struggling with something they don't know how to express in words.
So what are we talking about here? What are some examples of disruptive behavior disorders?
The textbook focuses on two main ones: oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, and conduct disorder. Let's start with ODD. Imagine a child who is constantly arguing with adults, refusing to follow rules, deliberately annoying others, blaming others for their mistakes, and being easily annoyed or angered.
It sounds like the quintessential rebellious teenager, but happening at a much younger age.
Exactly. And while some degree of defiance is normal during adolescence, with ODD, these behaviors are much more frequent, intense, and persistent. They cause significant distress for the child, their family, and often their teachers and peers.
So it goes beyond just being a difficult child. It's a pattern of behavior that interferes with their ability to function in different areas of their life.
Right. And it's important to note that ODD often co-occurs with other disorders, like ADHD or anxiety. So you might have a child who's struggling with inattention and impulsivity on top of their defiant behavior, which can make things even more challenging.
No, the textbook makes it clear that conduct disorder is even more serious than ODD.
It is. Conduct disorder involves a pattern of behavior that violates the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms or rules. We're talking about aggression towards people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious rule violations.
So it's not just about talking back or refusing to do chores. It's about engaging in behaviors that are harmful and destructive.
Exactly. Think about a child who bullies other kids, gets into physical fights, sets fires, steals, or runs away from home. These behaviors are beyond typical childhood mischief. They're indicative of a serious problem that needs professional attention.
The textbook mentions that without treatment, children with conduct disorder are at increased risk for problems later in life.
That's right. They're more likely to have difficulty maintaining relationships, holding down jobs, and staying out of trouble with the law. Early intervention is crucial to help these children develop more pro-social behaviors and avoid negative consequences down the road.
It sounds like a really tough situation for everyone involved, the child, their family, and the community.
It is. And it's important to approach these challenges with compassion and understanding. These children aren't bad. They're struggling, and they need our help to learn how to manage their emotions and behaviors in a healthy way.
Speaking of challenging emotions, let's shift gears and talk about separation anxiety disorder. This is one that I can relate to as a parent. The thought of my child being terrified to leave my side is just heartbreaking.
It's definitely a tough one for both the child and their caregivers. Separation anxiety is a normal part of development, especially in those early years. But for some children, the anxiety becomes so intense and persistent that it interferes with their daily life.
So what does that look like? What are some signs that a child might have separation anxiety disorder?
Well, imagine a child who has a complete meltdown every time they have to go to school or daycare. They might cry uncontrollably, cling to their parents, complain of physical symptoms like stomach aches or headaches, and even have nightmares about being separated from their loved ones.
It sounds like their anxiety takes over their whole world.
It can feel that way for them. They might worry constantly about something bad happening to their parents or to themselves while they're apart. They might refuse to sleep alone, have difficulty concentrating at school, and avoid social situations that involve being away from their caregivers.
It must be incredibly draining for the child and their family.
It is. And it can be tempting for parents to give in to the child's demands and avoid separations altogether. But that can actually make the anxiety worse in the long run.
So what's the best approach? How do we help these kids overcome their fear of separation?
Therapy is often very helpful, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on changing negative thought patterns and developing coping skills. Gradual exposure to separations, starting with short periods and slowly increasing the time, can also be effective.
It's like desensitizing them to the experience of being apart.
Exactly, and it's important to create a supportive, a predictable environment for the child. Having consistent routines, clear communication, and predictable goodbyes can help reduce their anxiety.
It's about giving them a sense of security and control in a situation that feels very scary and out of control for them.
Right. Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about fanatic disorders. These can be really perplexing for parents because they often involve behaviors that seem intentional, but in reality are involuntary.
Like, the child is choosing to do these things, but they're not.
Exactly. Tics are sudden, rapid, recurrent, non-rhythmic motor movements or vocalizations.
Can you give us some concrete examples? What kinds of things might we see in a child with a manic disorder?
Well, motor tics might involve things like eye blinking, grimacing, head jerking, shoulder shrugging, or even more complex movements like jumping or touching objects. Vocal tics might include throat clearing, sniffing, grunting, barking, or even repeating words or phrases.
It sounds like a wide range of behaviors, some subtle, some much more noticeable.
It is a spectrum, and the severity and complexity of NTics can vary greatly from person to person. Some children might have only one or two simple tics that come and go, while others might have multiple complex tics that occur frequently throughout the day.
The textbook mentions that most tics are transient, meaning they go away on their own, but some can become chronic.
That's right. Transient tics are quite common in childhood, especially during times of stress or excitement. They usually last for a few weeks or months and then disappear without any intervention.
So if a parent notices their child blinking a lot or clearing their throat repeatedly, it's not necessarily a cause for alarm.
Not right away, but if the tics persist for more than a year, become more frequent or severe, or interfere with the child's daily life, then it's definitely worth seeking professional evaluation.
The textbook also talks about Tourette's disorder, which is a more complex manic disorder.
Yes, Tourette's syndrome involves both motor and vocal tics that have been present for at least a year. The tics can wax and wane in severity, but they're persistent and can be quite distressing for the individual.
I've heard that people with Tourette's sometimes shout out obscenities or make inappropriate comments.
That's a common misconception. While coprolalia, the involuntary utterance of obscene words or socially inappropriate remarks, is a symptom of Tourette's, it's actually quite rare. Only about 10% of individuals with Tourette's experience coprolalia.
So it's not the defining feature of Tourette's, as many people believe.
Right, and it's important to remember that people with Tourette's can't control their tics, even if those Tourette's tics involve vocalizations that might be embarrassing or offensive.
It sounds like a very challenging condition to live with.
It can be, but many people with Tourette's learn to manage their tics and live fulfilling lives. There are behavioral therapies that can help reduce trepidating frequency and severity, and medications can be used to manage those associated symptoms like anxiety or ADHD, which are often present in individuals with Tourette's.
So there's hope for those struggling with this disorder.
Absolutely. Now, let's delve into a topic that's often misunderstood and even stigmatized: childhood depression.
I think a lot of people have a hard time grasping the concept of childhood depression. They think, well, all kids get sad sometimes. It's part of growing up.
That's true. Sadness is a normal human emotion, and children experience their fair share of disappointments, frustrations, and losses. But childhood depression goes beyond that transient sadness.
Yeah.
It's a pervasive mood disorder that affects a child's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physical well-being.
So what are some signs that a child might be depressed? What should parents be looking for?
The symptoms of childhood depression can be quite different from those we see in adults. While adults with depression often report feeling sad or hopeless, children might be more likely to express their depression through irritability, anger, or behavioral problems.
So a child who's constantly throwing tantrums, acting out, or withdrawing from activities they used to enjoy might actually be depressed.
Exactly. And it's important to look for changes in their sleep patterns, appetite, energy levels, and concentration. A child who's suddenly sleeping much more or much less than usual, losing or gaining weight, having trouble focusing in school, or complaining of frequent headaches or stomach aches might be struggling with depression.
It's like their whole system is out of whack.
That's a good way to put it. And it's important to remember that children might not always be able to articulate their feelings or understand what they're going through. They might not even realize they're depressed. They just know they feel bad and they don't know how to make it stop.
So it's up to the adults in their lives to recognize the signs and get them the help they need.
Absolutely. And early intervention is crucial. Untreated childhood depression can have serious consequences, including academic problems, social isolation, substance abuse, and even suicidal thoughts or behaviors.
This deep dive has been so insightful, but it's also a bit overwhelming. It feels like there's so much to be aware of as a parent or caregiver.
I understand. It can be daunting to think about all the potential challenges that children might face, but it's also empowering to know that there are things we can do to support them, to recognize those signs of struggle, and to seek professional help when needed.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, I want to make sure we touch on one more category of childhood mental disorders that the textbook covers: anxiety disorder.
Of course, anxiety disorders are incredibly common in childhood, and they can manifest in many different ways. The textbook focuses on a few specific types, including generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and phobias.
Let's start with generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. What does that look like in a child?
Children with GAD worry excessively about a wide range of things, from school and friends to family, health, and world events. Their worries are often unrealistic or out of proportion to the situation, but they can't seem to control them.
So it's like their worry switch is stuck in the on position.
That's a good analogy. And this constant worry can lead to physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, muscle tension, fatigue, and difficulty sleeping. Children with GAD might also be irritable, restless, and have trouble concentrating.
It sounds exhausting, both for the child and for those around them.
It is, and it can be hard to distinguish GAD from those normal childhood worries, especially since all kids experience anxiety from time to time.
So what are some red flags that might indicate something more serious is going on?
Well, if a child's worries are interfering with their daily life, preventing them from participating in activities they enjoy, or causing significant distress, then it's definitely worth seeking professional evaluation.
Now, what about social anxiety disorder? How is that different from GAD?
Social anxiety disorder involves an intense fear of social situations, particularly those where the child might be judged or evaluated by others.
So think school presentations, parties, or even just casual conversations with peers.
Exactly. Children with social anxiety might worry about saying or doing the wrong thing, blushing, sweating, or appearing awkward or foolish. They might avoid social situations altogether or endure them with extreme distress.
It can be incredibly isolating for these kids.
It can. They might withdraw from friends and activities, have difficulty making eye contact, and struggle to express themselves verbally.
I imagine this can really impact their self-esteem and their ability to form healthy relationships.
It can, and without intervention, social anxiety can persist into adulthood and significantly limit a person's opportunities and quality of life.
Now, the textbook also mentions panic disorder. This one sounds particularly scary.
It can be. Panic disorder involves recurrent and unexpected panic attacks, which are sudden episodes of intense fear that come on without warning.
What does a panic attack feel like?
Imagine a wave of terror washing over you, accompanied by physical symptoms like a racing heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, sweating, trembling, and a feeling of impending doom.
Wow, that sounds terrifying.
It is. And children experiencing a panic attack might think they're having a heart attack or going crazy.
Oh,
They can be very frightening.
so how do we help a child who's having a panic attack?
The first step is to stay calm and reassuring. Let the child know that you're there for them and that the panic attack will pass.
It's important not to dismiss their fear or tell them to just calm down.
Exactly. Encourage them to take slow, deep breaths and focus on their surroundings. Distraction techniques like counting or naming objects can also be helpful.
And if panic attacks are recurring, professional help is essential.
Absolutely. Cognitive behavioral therapy can teach children how to manage their anxiety and cope with panic attacks. Medications can also be used to reduce anxiety and prevent panic attacks, but therapy is often the first line of treatment.
The textbook also briefly mentions phobias. What are those exactly?
Phobias are persistent and irrational fears of specific objects or situations.
Like a fear of spiders, heights, or enclosed spaces.
Exactly. These fears are out of proportion to the actual danger posed by the object or situation, but they can cause significant distress and interfere with the child's life.
So if a child has a phobia of dogs, they might avoid going to parks, visiting friends who have dogs, or even walking down the street if they see a dog in the distance.
Right. And their fear might lead to avoidance behaviors, panic attacks, and significant limitations in their daily life.
So how do we help children overcome their phobias?
Exposure therapy is often very effective.
Exposure therapy.
It involves gradually exposing the child to the feared object or situation in a safe and controlled environment, starting with small steps and gradually increasing the intensity of the exposure.
It's about helping them face their fears and learn that they can cope.
Exactly. And it's often combined with relaxation techniques and cognitive strategies to help manage the anxiety associated with the phobia. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this segment, from disruptive behavior disorders and separation anxiety to trachecs, depression and anxiety disorders. It's clear that childhood mental health is a complex and multifaceted topic.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we really have.
But I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the challenges that so many children face and the importance of recognizing, supporting, and seeking help when needed.
I hope so too. Early intervention is really key.
Absolutely. Before we wrap things up entirely, I wanted to revisit something from our psychology textbook. It mentions that childhood mental disorders are often seen as exaggerations of normal behavior.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
And it reminds us that kids by nature can be challenging.
Oh, for sure.
You know, they have tantrums, they push boundaries, they test our patience.
Yeah, they definitely do.
But the key is knowing when those behaviors cross the line from typical kid stuff to something more serious, right?
Exactly.
So how do we make that distinction? Where's that line?
Well, the textbook emphasizes that we need to look at the degree, duration, and impact of those behaviors. Is it happening all the time, across different settings, and interfering with the child's ability to function? That's when it's time to be concerned.
And we also need to consider the child's developmental stage, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What's normal for a 2-year-old might be a red flag for a 10-year-old.
Exactly. A toddler having a meltdown because they can't have a cookie is developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
A teenager having a meltdown because they can't have a cookie, that's probably a sign of something else going on.
Totally. Context is everything.
It really is.
And the textbook stresses that the presence of impairment and the degree of distress are key factors in determining whether a child's behavior is a sign of a disorder.
Right. It's not just about the behavior itself, but also the impact it's having on the child's life and their ability to cope.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's made me realize that childhood mental disorders are not something to be ashamed of or to ignore. They're real medical conditions that require attention and support.
I couldn't agree more. And the earlier we identify and address these challenges, the better the outcomes for the child and their family.
So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
First and foremost, I hope they'll remember that childhood mental disorders are more common than many people realize. They affect real children and families, And it's crucial to break down the stigma surrounding these conditions.
Yeah, that stigma can be a huge barrier to seeking help, which can have devastating consequences.
Absolutely. I also hope listeners will remember that these disorders are diverse and complex. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding or treatment. We need to look at each child as an individual and consider their unique circumstances.
It's not about labeling kids or putting them in boxes. It's about understanding their struggles and helping them find the support they need to thrive.
Exactly. And finally, I hope listeners will take away a sense of hope. With early identification, appropriate interventions, and a supportive environment, children with mental disorders can lead fulfilling and meaningful lives.
That's a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but I think it's raised some important questions for all of us to ponder. How can we, as a society, better support children and families dealing with these challenges? What can we do to reduce stigma and promote understanding?
Those are excellent questions, and I encourage our listeners to continue exploring this topic. Read books, listen to podcasts, talk to experts, and most importantly, listen to the stories of those who have lived experience with these disorders.
The more we learn, the better equipped we are to create a world where all children, regardless of their challenges, can reach their full potential. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of childhood mental disorders.